Glad to be here with this Gazelle's audience to talk about this. Hi, I'm Pat Lencioni. I'm the president of the Table Group and the author of the new book, The Advantage: Why Organizational Health Trumps Everything Else in Business. I'm really glad to be here with this Gazelle's audience to talk about this book, which is really the culmination of the work I've done in my career and 20 years of working with executives and teams in every kind of organization. And I'm really excited about the premise of this book, and I utterly believe that it's true. I believe that organizational health, which we'll be defining in this talk, is the ultimate and most untapped competitive advantage in business today. In this world of ubiquitous information and the nanosecond technology change and the internet, I find that almost every company has enough intelligence and domain expertise to be successful. What most organizations lack is health. What I mean by that is this. Let me explain what organizational health is. There's two things that every organization that succeeds has to be very good at the highest level. On the one hand, an organization has to be smart. That has to do with things like strategy and marketing and technology and operations and all those kind of decision sciences that we learned about in business school or that you read about in business magazines or in the media. Now, in addition to being smart, and that stuff is very important, very important. I started my career at Bain & Company, and we essentially were there to do research to help companies make smarter decisions. So nobody should ever tell you that stuff isn't important. However, the other side of the equation, the other half of what we need to do to make our organizations better and maximize our potential is that we have to make them healthy. A healthy organization is one that has minimal politics, minimal confusion, and high degrees of morale and productivity and very low turnover among good people. So we have smart and we have healthy. Now, most executives that I take through this, they will say, you know, if I could make my organization healthy, I know that would be great. I know it would help us. That drives me crazy. It keeps me up at night. I really should do that, but I don't know how to measure it. I didn't really learn about it in business school. And, you know, it's probably a little soft, maybe even a little messy and emotional. You know, I think I'm going to go tweak the dials on the smart side of the equation. I think I'm going to go tweak the dials in marketing or technology or strategy or finance because that's where I'm comfortable. It reminds me of that old episode of I Love Lucy, where Ricky comes home from work and he sees his wife Lucy crawling around the living room and he says, "What are you doing?" And she says, "I'm looking for my earrings." And he says, "You lost your earrings out here in the living room?" And she says, "No, I lost them in the bedroom, but the light out here is much better." And that's what so many executives do. They look for solutions or for opportunities to improve their business in places where they're comfortable, where the light is better. The truth of the matter is, though, in this day and age, as I said before, the biggest opportunity for transformation and improvement and for meaningful competitive advantage is to be found in making our organizations healthy. And that's because healthy organizations tap into more of the intelligence they have. As I like to say, if you had an organization that was a 10 out of 10 in intelligence, but it was only 4 or 5 out of 10 in terms of organizational health, that dysfunction is not going to allow them to tap into all the knowledge and experience they have. But an organization that's healthy is going to tap into all of their intelligence. And so I call it the multiplier effect. You're going to actually be able to multiply the knowledge you have more if you're healthy. Now, really smart organizations don't necessarily have any advantage in becoming healthier. Because sometimes, as a function of their intelligence, they have a harder time learning from others. But healthy organizations, which tend to be more humble and functional, when something bad happens or when they need to discover something new in their business, they tend to be really good at finding alternatives, finding solutions, and embracing them. So I fundamentally believe that it's the organizations that can make themselves healthy are the ones that outcompete the ones that are smart. Now, just to give you a couple of examples, and I know we have an audience probably from all over the world, but here in the United States, there's a great company, an airline, and an airline is a very difficult business these days, as we all know, but Southwest Airline is a company that continues to perform even during difficult times. Still to this day hasn't had to do a layoff. People love to work there. Their customers are fanatically loyal to them. No other airline of any large airline can say the same thing as Southwest Airline. A few new ones are starting to do the same kind of thing. What is it that makes Southwest so strong and so much of a better competitor than their other competition? It's because they have a healthy organization. Are they smarter than United Airlines or Delta or American or whatever they're combined into these days? No. They don't have more PhDs from Ivy League schools. They don't have more domain expertise or industry knowledge. What they have is the understanding that building a healthy organization will allow them to make better decisions, make their customers feel better about them, make their employees feel better about them, and ultimately that will affect their bottom line. Healthy organizations win. So the question becomes, if we buy into this, and as we look through some of these slides, as we buy into this, we have to ask ourselves, what does a healthy organization do? How do we go about making our organizations healthy? Before I go into more detail on this, so let me just say this. I mentioned before that organizational health is still largely untapped in business. Now, I hope that 10 years from now, that's not the case. I really hope that 10 years from now, making your organization healthy becomes a standard in all businesses. Just like having good technology or financial systems or strategy, I hope that people say, well, we can't even think about making this company successful if we're not making it healthy. Okay, before we go on, let me go back and tell a story about Southwest Airlines just to drive all of this home. Because we talked before about the fact that this is an untapped advantage. And I hope 10 years from now that it's not. I hope it's a standard in business, that people sit down to say, okay, we're going to start a business or we're going to work on our business. The first thing we have to do is make it healthy. Just like they wouldn't think about having a great company without good technology or financial systems or strategy, I hope that organizational health becomes a standard in that way too. But here's a point that drives this home for me, why it's still so untapped and why so many organizations are still not healthy and why an organization that gets healthy can have such a strong competitive advantage and such a great point of differentiation. So I was at Southwest Airlines and I was at a management conference, and this was about a year and a half ago, and I was listening to all these amazing presentations from managers and senior executives about all the great things they're doing to make Southwest a great company for their customers and their employees. And I was sitting next to the CEO, and I leaned over to him and asked him really what was a rhetorical question. I said, Gary, why don't your competitors do any of this stuff? And I didn't really expect an answer, but he thought about it for a second, and with a kind of a sad look on his face, he leaned over and he said to me, Pat, I honestly think that they believe it's beneath them. And the thing about making an organization healthy, and we're just about to go into the disciplines of doing that, the thing about making an organization healthy is it requires us to do some things that are simple in theory, but require some courage and some persistence. And many organizations find it too unsophisticated, and so they just don't do it. Of course, ultimately they lose out on the bottom line and their performance suffers. Companies like Southwest Airlines and other great companies are willing to do things that other companies aren't because they know it's the right thing to do. And that's what I want to talk about today, how to go about building a healthy organization. And there are 4 disciplines that are required to do that. Okay, let's quickly go through the 4 disciplines of a healthy organization. The first of which is we have to build and maintain a cohesive leadership team at the top. The leaders of an organization, in order for the company to be healthy, and whether we're talking about a department within a company or a corporation or a startup or a church or a school, it doesn't matter. The leaders in charge of that organization have to become cohesive behaviorally. They have to be good at things like building trust, engaging in good conflict, healthy conflict, committing to decisions even when they disagreed, holding each other accountable for their decisions and for the behaviors they've agreed on, and finally focusing on the collective results or the outcomes of the team. This is what I cover in my book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. But in my book, The Advantage, I go into a little bit more detail and draw upon some of our experiences and case studies from the last 10 years since I've written that first book. So the first discipline of a healthy organization is building a cohesive leadership team. The second discipline is about creating clarity, and this goes hand in hand. In addition to being behaviorally cohesive, that leadership team has to also answer 6 simple but critical questions and be completely aligned and unambiguously committed to the answer to those 6 questions. And we'll go over those 6 questions in a few minutes. So once an organization has become, their leadership team has become cohesive behaviorally and answered these 6 questions and created clarity around these critical issues, then and only then do they move on to the next thing, which is to over-communicate that clarity, to over-communicate the answers to those 6 questions. They have to remind people of those answers over and over again, and over and over and over again, and over and over again. Research now shows that people have to hear things 7 times before they believe it. 7 times. And I call that the Dilbert effect, because people are used to to their leaders in their organization saying, quality is job 1, and customers are always right, and employees are our greatest asset. And they start to sound like the parents on Charlie Brown cartoons that sound like wah, 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 wah. It's just generic talk, just a generic speech. Employees are waiting for their leaders to repeat things enough so that they actually believe that they're serious and committed to those answers. And the best leaders in healthy organizations over-communicate messages. Yes, over-communicate more than they think they need to. Too often leaders under-communicate. This is a very common problem in unhealthy organizations. They under-communicate because they think that they're being redundant by repeating themselves. And while redundancy may be a bad thing in certain areas of business, when it comes to communication, it's very good. I like to say that if people can't do a good impression of you when you're not around, you're not communicating enough as a leader. You know, many executives who don't like to over-communicate remind me of that old story of the wife that says to her husband, "Why don't you ever tell me you love me?" And the husband is a little surprised and says, "Well, you know, I told you when we got married, I'll let you know if it changes." And that's what too many leaders do. They think that I gave that speech at the beginning of the year, at the kickoff meeting, and I put the slides on the intranet. Nothing's changed. You know, why do you think that maybe they did? The point of the matter is this. In great organizations, leaders and the CEO is not just the CEO. He or she is the CRO, the Chief Reminding Officer. One of the most important things they have to do is remind people over and over again. You know, the CEO of a fabulous telecommunications company, after they'd done well for many years, was interviewed when he was retiring, and they said, "What did you do that made the company so great?" And he was a CEO for 6 years. He said, "You know, I don't know. Basically, for the last 6 years, I've just gone around and repeated myself." And there is something so true about that. We have to over-communicate. And what are we over-communicating? That clarity, the answer to those 6 questions. Finally, what a healthy organization will do is then reinforce those 6 answers. They'll reinforce them through some basic human systems, like how do we recruit? How do we decide to hire someone? How do we orient them to our company? How do we set goals, manage them, reward them? How do we decide whether we're going to fire somebody or not? And how do we make decisions? In healthy organizations, in addition to communicating that clarity, they have to reinforce it, but not in a bureaucratic way. Someone once said, I wish I knew who did, that a great company has to institutionalize its culture without bureaucratizing it. And I love that. We have to institutionalize it without bureaucratizing it. That means we can't have performance management systems or hiring profiles that are so onerous or so overburdening that people hate doing them. We have to put just enough structure in place and no more. So those are the 4 disciplines of a healthy organization. If you can make your leadership team in your organization cohesive behaviorally, if you can answer those 6 questions and build real alignment and clarity among the executives, if you can then go out and communicate the heck out of those answers and put just enough structure in place to reinforce them, your company, your organization will find that it's almost impossible to fail. And I honestly believe that. Healthy organizations have a certain resiliency about them. When something difficult happens, when a problem occurs, they rally around it, and they're functional enough to turn it into an opportunity. Really smart organizations, on the other hand, that are unhealthy, oftentimes they get completely devastated by changes in the market or things they couldn't predict. So making your organization healthy is the best guarantee, or as close as you can get, to ultimate long-term success. I fundamentally believe that's true. Okay, now let's go through each of these disciplines and look at some of the key points in how to bring them about in our organizations. Okay, first let's talk about mastering the 5 behaviors of a cohesive leadership team. Now in my book, as I said earlier, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, I present a fictional case study around this to help people understand that. And I think readers have really appreciated that. What I do in this book, though, is I go into more detail and a little bit more practical advice based on what we've learned in the last 10 years. Right now, what I'd like to do is take you through a few highlights around the 5 behaviors that a cohesive leadership team embraces. And the first one is trust. Now, when we talk about trust on a leadership team, I'm not talking about predictive trust, which is the kind of trust that comes about when people have known each other long enough or worked together long enough to be able to predict one another's behaviors. Any 2 people that have worked together for a while can say, yeah, I can trust him or her because I know how they're going to react if I say this. Predictive trust isn't what makes a team strong. The kind of trust I'm talking about is vulnerability-based trust. The trust that comes about when human beings on a team can be completely vulnerable or buck naked with each other, if you will, around their strengths, their weaknesses, when they know the answer, when they don't know the answer, when they've made a mistake, or when they need to apologize. And when you can build that kind of vulnerability-based trust, transparency-based trust on a team, it changes everything. But the leader has to go first. The leader has to be willing to demonstrate trust by leap of faith. They have to be vulnerable and acknowledge themselves and their strengths and their weaknesses in order for the other people on the team to be able to do that. And too often, the leader doesn't do that. I'll tell you a real quick story. I worked with a famous leader who you've heard of. And I worked with him a few companies ago, and he was younger in his career. And at the time, I don't think he was a great leader. Now, he was a very brilliant, intimidating, and famous guy. So nobody ever gave him feedback. Nobody ever challenged him. Well, the human resources executive, God bless her, she realized that this was a problem, and she went to him and said, listen, you've got to get feedback, and you've got to get your people to weigh in on issues with you, and they're just not challenging you. So he reluctantly agreed to do 360 feedback with her. Well, he got the results back, and my little firm administered this 360 tool, and sometimes 360 feedback is good, sometimes not. Well, we gave him the results of the feedback from his department, and he proceeded to show those results to no one. So she convinced him that he needed to go over the results with his team. So at his next staff meeting, he'd agreed to do this, and he stood up there in front of the team, and he said, okay, it says here that I'm not a very good listener. What do you guys think? And one by one, they went around the table and told him that they all thought he was a good listener and that they didn't really think that was a problem. And he was more than happy to accept that feedback. And I remember sitting there at the time thinking, I could never put this in one of my books because nobody would believe it. So then he stood up and he said, okay, it says here I could give more, I don't give enough feedback or enough praise. I thought I'd gotten better at this. What do you guys think? And one by one, they went around the table and all said, no, I think you give plenty of feedback. Well, this is a point where I realized as a consultant I had to lose a client or put one in jeopardy because I had to have enough integrity to stand there in the danger and confront this situation. So I rolled my chair up next to the CEO in the room and I said, excuse me, gentlemen, because they were all guys at the table. I said, you're the only people who filled this survey out, so somebody had to write this stuff in their survey. And finally, one of the executives timidly raised his hand and said, yeah, I would like to get, my team would like to get more feedback. I realize that, you never give us feedback unless we screw up something. So I think that you could be better at that one. I agree with that. And it was very silent in the room. Until finally the head lawyer said, oh, I think you give plenty of feedback. And everybody else said, so do I. I don't know what this guy's talking about. I think you're great at this. And they just crushed this guy. The point of that story is that's the day the CEO lost his credibility and sent a message to the team that I'm not going to be vulnerable. I'm not going to admit that I have any problems. And so you probably shouldn't either. Eventually, that company spun out of control, was sold off for a fraction of its worth, and of course, the CEO moved on to another company. And what do you think the Wall Street Journal or Business Week wrote about that company in its epitaph? It said, oh, they made strategic errors. They had problems with their products. Those were true, but those were downstream symptoms of the real problem. The real problem with that company was that there was no trust on the executive team. As a result, the team wasn't cohesive. As a result, there was no clarity. They were unhealthy. And that is what torpedoed that company. But of course, when you're looking at it forensically, the first thing you look at is, well, what's the most recent thing that happened? But what they don't realize is that on that executive team, there was no trust. And if there's not trust on an executive team, they cannot be cohesive. So when you get leaders on your team to trust one another by being vulnerable, by acknowledging what they're not good at, by being willing to admit who they are, that allows them to have the courage to engage in healthy conflict. Because if they trust each other, they know that conflict is nothing but the pursuit of truth or the best possible answer. You see, teams that trust each other know that when we debate or argue, we're just trying to solve a problem. When they don't trust each other, now they think they're trying to win. and that becomes politics. So trust is so important on a team because it enables us to engage in healthy conflict. Conflict is critical. Now, it looks different from culture to culture, family to family, company to company, and that's okay, as long as you know that people on your team are not holding back. People on your team cannot be choosing their battles. They can't be calculating the political cost of disagreement. When there's something important at stake, they'll always be willing to weigh in with a differing opinion if necessary. Now, why is that so important? Because without conflict, we can't possibly overcome the next challenge or embrace the next idea on a team, which is we have to come to commitment around the decisions we make. We have to actively commit, even if we disagreed. Intel, the great microchip company, has a great saying, disagree and commit. And when people disagree around a decision, they have to passionately weigh in. And I'm a big believer that if people don't weigh in on a decision, they will not buy into that decision. Once they've weighed in, even if they're not in agreement, now the leader does his or her job and breaks the tie. And when the leader breaks the tie, the people on that team, even if they disagreed, now have to rally around that decision. Do you know Intel has discovered that 99.5 times out of 100, even when people disagreed, if they weigh in, if they know that their input has been heard and considered and factored into the ultimate decision, they will support that decision even if they disagreed. But conflict is necessary. And of course, trust is necessary for good conflict. Now, commitment allows us to overcome the next challenge to a team and embrace the next principle of accountability. On our online team assessment that teams fill out, this is usually the lowest area. Teams have to be willing, teammates, to hold one another accountable for the decisions they've made. Now, notice what I said, hold one another accountable. It's not about the leader being the only source of accountability. The primary source is peers. Peers have got to be able to turn to one another and say, we can do better and we need more from you. Because when we do that as a team, we enable ourselves to embrace the last principle of a great team, which is the focus on results. No team can afford to take their eye off the ball. A great team is not one that just likes each other and gets along well, but they actually accomplish things. They win football games if they're a football team. They hit their numbers if they're a company. Do they always do that? No. But they generally accomplish what they set out to accomplish. So those are the 5 behaviors at the heart of a team. I'd like to go into more detail, but I really want to move on to the second discipline. Now, without the first discipline, we're not going to be able to answer these 6 questions. Because if we don't have the kind of dialogue that we need, we're not going to come to real commitment around those. But there are 6 questions when it comes to creating clarity that we have to answer in very clear detail. And they are simple questions, but they are critically important. Now, what I find is that most executive teams I work with, whether it's the CEO and his or her direct reports or a department head or a small startup venture, whatever it is, what I find is that most of those leaders know the nuanced details of their business, their cost structure, their technical details, but they aren't necessarily aligned around the most important basic things. And that's what these are. The mission statement. Too many companies out there think that clarity can be created by writing a mission statement. And we've all seen this. It's a long paragraph that tries to do everything and ends up doing nothing. And in my book, one of the things I do is I put up, and you'll see here, the mission statement of a company. And I ask people to try to guess what company it is. Now, you can see that I've redacted the name of the company and the industry. And so let's read this together. It says, Blank Incorporated provides its customers with quality blank products and the expertise required for making informed buying decisions. We provide our products and services with a dedication to the highest degree of integrity and quality of customer satisfaction, developing long-term professional relationships with employees that develop pride, creating a stable working environment and company spirit. Now, that is as generic as you can think of, and it seems to apply to a lot of companies. I've seen mission statements just like this throughout my career. Well, I ask people to try to guess what company it is, and they're always shocked, because it's actually a fictitious company called Dunder Mifflin, which is from the TV show The Office, which many people have seen. You see, this is a spoof. It's a joke. And yet it sounds just like real mission statements that we read every day. And we have to get away from thinking that the mission statement is how we're going to create clarity. No, instead, we need to come up with 6 answers to 6 critical questions. And those questions include the following. Why do we exist as a company? Why do we exist? What is the underlying reason why this organization needs to be? Porras and Collins in their book Good to Great first introduced the concept of core purpose, and this is very related to that. Why do we exist as a company? Now, there are different reasons why a company might exist. It might be to serve their customers, and that's their ultimate reason for being. Another one might be to provide people with jobs. Another one might be because we represent something that in a way we want to change the world. There's all kinds of different purposes or reasons for existing that I lay out in the book. The point is you have to know yours and you have to be clear about it because you don't ever want to violate that. It gives your employees a reason to get out of bed in the morning and it allows them to understand why what they're doing ultimately matters. Okay, the second question is another one I love to talk about, which is how do we behave? And again, this gets similarly at the idea of core values. Porras and Collins write about this in Built to Last, and I wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review about 10 years ago about this. And what we have to do is really understand the 1 or 2, maybe 3 behavioral values that are inherent to who we are and how we're supposed to behave and treat one another. When an organization has no clear values, or worse yet, when they have 12, and they get a thesaurus out and they look up the 12 nicest adjectives they can find to encompass all perfect things, they leave employees without any guidelines for their behavior. Healthy organizations are very clear from the top down that here are the ways that we expect people to act. And if you embody these principles, beyond that, all diversity is good. But what we have to do is make sure that we're adhering to a very few set of core principles so that people know how to behave. This is what creates a culture. It attracts the right employees and repels the others. It even attracts the right customers and repels the others. A great story we heard years ago about Southwest Airlines again was about a woman who didn't like the fact that flight attendants were making jokes during the safety check on the airline. Well, one of the core values of Southwest Airlines is having a sense of humor, what they call a fun-loving spirit. You have to be able to laugh at yourself, whether you're a pilot, whether you're a baggage handler, a flight attendant, or whether you're a customer service agent. Well, one woman flew on an airline on one of their flights, and they made jokes during the safety check. I've been on a flight before where they said, in the event of a water landing, we'll be coming by with drinks and towels. Now, what you need to know is Southwest takes safety very seriously. However, they have a sense of humor. Well, this woman didn't appreciate that humor. She wrote the CEO at the time, Herb Kelleher, a note that said, I really don't think you should make jokes during the safety check. I find that kind of disturbing. I'm a long-time flyer and a frequent flyer of yours, and I think that you should do something about that because I don't like that. Well, most airlines or other companies would have sent her a note saying, we value you as a customer. Here's a free flight segment or a drink coupon. And please know that we take safety seriously and we appreciate you as a customer, and we'll take care of this. And then they'd have called the local gate agent wherever she flew out of, and they probably would have said, maybe you should tone it down during the safety check. Some people find that offensive, and that's probably not something we need to do. Well, when it's a core value, you don't sacrifice it for expedience sake. You allow yourself at times to be punished for it because you believe it's important. So the CEO at the time reportedly sent this woman a note, and there were only 3 words on the note. It said, we'll miss you. We'll miss you. They said, listen, this is who we are. We are the airline with a personality, and part of that is a sense of humor. And we're not going to sell our soul to prove that we're something we're not. We're going to stand behind who we are because our customers have come to expect that, our employees enjoy that, our executives enjoy that, and that's who we are. And if we're going to lose a customer for that, that's okay because we're going to gain hundreds of others who love that about us. So we need to know who we are so we know what to say we'll miss you about. Because everything else doesn't deserve a we'll miss you note. But our core values do. Okay, the next question is a very simple one that takes usually 10 or 15 minutes for an executive team to answer, if that, and that is, what do we actually do? Some companies, it's one thing to know what our values are and why we exist, but you also have to know what business you're in. And every once in a while, we'll come up to an executive team that's not quite sure. Are we a product company or a services company? Are we in that business or that business? So this is usually a short conversation, but it's an important one to make sure that we're getting right. Okay, the next question. How will we succeed? How will we succeed? This is another way of asking the question, without using jargon, about what is our unique strategy for winning in the market. Now, the problem with that word strategy is that every business defines it differently. Some use strategy to mean one thing. Another one, it's tactics. Another one, they include values in there. We have come up, and in the book we outline this, and I can't do it all here, but we have come up with a way to identify 3 strategic anchors. And it was Vern Harnish at Gazelles who said, yes, Pat, it's definitely 3. Because we said, maybe it should be 4. He goes, no, it's always 3. And there's something about 3 being the right number. An organization has to know the 3 strategic anchors that should inform every other decision it makes, even at a tactical level. And when you know what your company stands for strategically in the market, you can actually empower people, and yes, I use the E word, you can empower people to make decisions without micromanagement or a policy binder this thick. What you say to them is, whatever you do, make sure you don't violate this, this, or this, because this is how we're going to be different from our competitors, and this is how we're going to succeed. Find a way to do whatever you can creatively within the boundaries of those decisions. We have found that frees up employees to become more creative and empowered, not in some buzzword sense, but in a very actionable, compelling, practical way. So there's some exercises that we lay out in the book and a few case studies that any company will probably be able to read and then go back and have a 1 or 2 hour messy conversation and arrive at their own strategic anchors. And we think this is a very powerful thing for an organization to do. Okay, the 5th question, which is the one, well, let's jump down to the 6th one first, which is who must do what? I like to do the 6th one first because the 5th is the one I really want to end with, and I want to go into detail. Because I have found that the most cynical executive teams, the ones that think, wow, this might be too touchy-feely for me, when they get to that 5th question, even the most cynical ones go, oh, wow, if we don't answer that question, we have no chance to be successful. And it's from there that they realize that this organizational health stuff really is the competitive advantage that I say it is. But the 6th question is who must do what? The executive team, the leadership team of any organization, whether it's a church, a school, or a corporation, at the end of answering these questions has to say, okay, what do each of us now have to go out to do in our departments using our levels of expertise to make all of this work? We will get together once a week or every 2 weeks and put out our generic hats again and rally around whatever we have to do. But what are our unique responsibilities and deliverables? Okay, those are the 6 questions, absent number 5. Let's look at number 5 now. Number 5 is very, very specific and practical, and it is this. What is most important in our organization right now? What is most important right now? Now, what I love the saying, if everything is important, then nothing is. And too many organizations have way too many priorities. They end up peanut buttering out their time and not really accomplishing anything, especially the most important thing. So what we talk to organizations about is we say, you have to answer this question. What is the single most important thing going on in your organization right now? Or better yet, a better way to answer it is, what is the one thing we have to accomplish in the next X months if we're going to claim that we were successful, responsible leaders of this organization? Now, X months is important. It needs to be more than 3 months because organizations, if they're focused on a 2-month goal, that's usually pretty short term. Now, maybe a startup might do that, but we think that beyond 3 months is long enough period of time to get something done. But it has to be less than 12 months, because if you have a goal that's a 1.5 years or 3 or 5 years, you need those kind of things. But if you haven't shortened it down into a time frame that people can get their hands around, they often procrastinate and they think, oh, the market will probably change before 2 years are up and things will change, or I'm not even sure I'm going to work in this organization 2 years from now. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the most important thing we need to accomplish between 3 and 12 months? You get to pick the time frame. So maybe your organization says, okay, in the next 9 months, what's the one thing we have to accomplish in order to feel that we're successful? Now, I don't want this to be quantitative. You'll have plenty of opportunity to quantify this stuff later. It needs to be qualitative. It needs to be one thing. It needs to be shared across the entire executive team. And it needs to be something that people can rally around. We call this a rallying cry or a thematic goal. So let's take a look at how we go about determining our thematic goal or our rallying cry. Now, I'm going to use an example from a fictional tire manufacturer, but one might think of, and I've had this in mind, a company like Firestone Tires. About 10 years ago now, I would imagine, they were having some problems with their tires, some quality issues. Cars were supposedly rolling over. People were getting in accidents. It was a very bad time at their company. And I imagined what would that organization say their rallying cry was at the time? Now, the reason why I like to use a company in crisis is because what we've found is that organizations that are in crisis, or even better yet, organizations that actually live in crisis on a regular basis, are best at coming up with a rallying cry. And as a result of having that rallying cry, there's no silos. People in an emergency room at a hospital don't say, gee, what should we work on here? Or who's going to take care of that lady who's bleeding out? My department doesn't pay for gauze or bandages. They all rally around one thing that they know is important, and they don't care what department they work in. They don't care what budget things come from. They are focused on solving a big problem, and as a result, they're effective. Well, even companies, when they go into crisis, usually operate that way. And then when the crisis is averted or overcome, they go back into their silos. And what we've tried to say is this: how do we replicate what a company in crisis does to give them the best possible chance to rally without, of course, creating a false crisis, which is not a good idea? So what we decided to do is let's take a look at a fictitious company in crisis and see what we would come up with for them. So if we all here watching this are part of the executive team at Firestone Tires, we'd have to ask ourselves, what's the rallying cry? What's the thematic goal? In the next 9 months, what should we do in order to be successful? And the first answer would be, we have to fix the tires. That would be obvious, right? Sounds like a good answer. But you see, I have a question mark here. Because if the only thing we do in the next 9 months is fix the tires, as important as that may be, is that enough to say we've been successful? And most people would say no. In fact, the real rallying cry, the real thematic goal has to do with restoring our credibility or rebuilding trust in the market. The real rallying cry is, in the next 12 months, we have to survive by reestablishing credibility. And it doesn't matter what you call it. We're not talking about wordsmithing. We're talking about everyone on the leadership team first getting completely centered in their gut and aligned around the one thing that matters most. Whatever we do in the next 9 months, we need to reestablish credibility. Everything needs to pass through that filter. Okay, good enough. Then what should we do? Should we go make a poster or a t-shirt and give it to employees that says, reestablishing credibility? No, what does that mean? That's a campaign, it's a slogan, it's worthless. It makes people roll their eyes and think management's crazy. We have to now go to the next step, which is we have to come up with what we call defining objectives. Defining objectives are just the big buckets of stuff that we have to do in order to say that we'd reestablish credibility. And once again, they're qualitative. They're not quantitative. You can quantify them later. But what are the big categories of things we would have to do to reestablish credibility? Well, first, we would have to fix the tires. Second, we'd have to tell the world we'd fix the tires, improve our PR. Third, we'd have to go back to our distributors who actually sell these tires for us and repair our relationship with them. Fourth, we'd have to rebuild our employee morale because they're going to be bumming out. And finally, we'd have to settle the lawsuits. Now, when I go through executive teams, this same exercise, they come up with these without prompting because they're pretty obvious. But what's amazing is how many of our organizations don't have something this clear. Does your organization have a very clear rallying cry for the next 6 or 9 months? Do people know that there are 4 or 5 or 6 key levers that we're going to have to pull to get there? That's critical that we do that. Okay, now that we have those defining objectives, we know the 5 boxes of things that we need to do in order to establish credibility, we're still not quite done. Because the CFO can look at this and say, okay, this is great. What are we going to spend all of our money on PR programs and morale programs and give away all of our money in lawsuits? We're just going to throw money away? What about our business? Don't we have to stay in business? And you know something? That CFO is right. We have one final layer that we have to get clear around, and that is, what are the standard operating objectives for our organization? This is just the permission to play, to stay in business. And this was probably true, these same things, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, last year, a year from now, 3 years from now, and 5 years from now. It's the standard things we have to do to stay in business. And they are critical. What might they be? Well, they might be, we need to make revenue to pay our bills. We need to control our expenses. We need to continue to make tires at a production level that meets our needs. We have to maintain a certain market share. We have to keep customer satisfaction up. I don't know what they are, but I find that almost every organization has a fairly standard list. It's easy to come up with, and it doesn't differ that much from company to company. The key is that these standard operating objectives at the bottom are not enough to keep your people engaged. They're important, but what we have to always say is, what is the rallying cry? It's going to break down silos among executives, and it's going to give people a reason to care in the near term. Now, so you have this one piece of paper here, which we call the score sheet. The one piece of paper that says, here's the one thing that matters most, here's what we need to do to achieve it, and here's what we need to do just to stay in business. What we say is when you go to your meetings, use this piece of paper. Don't put it on a shelf and pull it out 3 months later or 6 months later for your next offsite. Use this piece of paper to begin every meeting you have. Meetings are critical in a healthy organization. They're not drudgery, they're how we stay focused. So how do you use this in meetings to keep your company focused? Well, when you get to your meetings, you have to you spend the first 5 or 10 minutes saying, how are we doing in these critical key areas? The first area, fixing the tires. You go look to the head of engineering and you say, how are we doing? And he or she says, I think we're doing well. I'm hitting all my numbers, but I want to know what everybody else thinks. Because this is not just about data. And what you'll notice is we're not going to use a numerical system for evaluating this. We're going to use the very sophisticated system of green for good, yellow for okay, red for bad. And maybe we let people use orange in between or lime green. We find that some of the most sophisticated data-driven companies want this and need this because the reams of data they have make it difficult for them to make decisions and judgments. They have to boil it down. So you go through with your team and you say, how are we doing on fixing the tires? And everybody agrees, yeah, we're doing great. That's a green. How about PR? Well, we agree it's yellow. Distributor relationships? Oh, Ford is so mad at us, they're never going to buy tires from us if we don't repair that relationship. That's a red. Morale is okay. Lawsuits are okay. Revenue is a lime green. You go through and you answer all these questions. It takes 5 or 10 minutes at the most. The people on the team love to do this because it gives them a sense of what's going on. Then you decide what you're going to talk about at your meetings. And you know something? We're going to talk about the things that are red and orange. We're not going to peanut butter our time out by giving everybody 15 minutes to give us an update on what they're working on, because that just puts everybody to sleep, and we end up spending our time in a non-strategic way. We are going to focus on the areas that need our attention most. And you know something else? The executives in the room whose job responsibilities don't seem to fall directly into any of these areas, they're still going to weigh in. And they're still going to try to help fix these problems. We find that the best ideas and the best advice often come from people who aren't really involved in these areas on a day-to-day basis because they have objective, fresh ideas. And when we peanut butter out our time in meetings into departmental stuff, when we reinforce silos by not having a thematic goal or a rallying cry, we cut off the benefit of those perspectives. I hope that makes sense. Sitting here talking this long, just so you know, I may pass out here in a second. I never talk this long in a row, and I hope that I'm keeping your interest here. Okay, so when we do this, it gives our company clarity. And this is one of the 6 questions we have to answer. So what do we do next? We've built a cohesive leadership team. We've used that cohesive team to answer these 6 questions unambiguously. Then, and only then, do we have to over-communicate. We have to go out and remind people about these 6 questions. Every time an executive talks to employees, whether it's a big employee meeting, whether it's a small meeting, whether they're talking to customers, whatever they're doing, they've got to constantly remind people of the answers to these 6 questions. That becomes paramount. They want to build it into everything they do. We have a client who I've never worked with, and many of our clients I haven't. They've just read our books and gone through our material and used it themselves or used some of our consultants out in the field. And I love to hear from these people. There was this one guy who had an equestrian-based company, and he was really frustrated in his business, was thinking about getting out of the business. He learned about organizational health. He embraced it and implemented it like nobody else, and he's totally revived his business. And now everything from when people call in for voicemail, or when he speaks to his customers, or every employee meeting he has, he starts by reminding people, here's why we exist, here's how we behave, here's what we do, here's what our strategic anchors are, how we'll succeed, here's what's important, our rallying cry right now. He goes through this list. And as a result, everybody knows what they're all about, and it's allowed them to build a really effective, functional organization. And he's loving his job again, and they're making more money than they ever have. It's a wonderful story of the simplicity of organizational health. So we have to over-communicate the answers to those 6 questions. And then finally, the last thing we have to do is we have to reinforce that clarity. And again, how do we do that? By building every human system we have around the answers to these 6 questions. Everything we do, from how we hire to how we fire to how we reward people, how we make decisions, has to be done in a customized way. So the executives have to be involved in that process. They can't just say to HR, go off and design a performance management system and find a generic one from General Electric that worked well for them. We are not General Electric. Let's build it around our culture, and let's keep it simple. Let's keep it simple. If we can't do it on one page, then there's probably something wrong. Let's make our structures and our human systems simple. When an organization builds a cohesive leadership team, answers these 6 questions, then communicates the crap out of those questions, and reinforces it at every turn, it becomes, as I said before, almost impossible to fail. Because they build a resilient organization, one where employees are empowered and excited, where customers become fanatically loyal to them. And when a problem occurs, something unexpected happens, they rally around the solution and they fix it quicker. And time after time, we run into really smart companies that can't figure out why these relatively unsophisticated companies are beating them in the market and outperforming them. And it's because they don't understand or they're not willing to embrace organizational health. So that brings me to the end of this exhaustive overview of the 4 disciplines and the 5 dysfunctions of a team and the 6 questions and the communication and the clarity. I hope you found it interesting. Now we're going to do some questions. So let's go to the question part of our presentation.
Pat, thank you. The presentation was great. Can I ask you some questions that can help Gazelle's companies implement your model? Why do you believe today is especially important for organizations to address organizational health?
You know, I think it's important for organizations today more than ever to address organizational health because there's just no other competitive advantages out there that really provide that much differentiation. I mean, what we see is that companies, even small companies, can do what a lot of bigger companies can do, which is great. They can use technology and they have sophisticated strategies where everybody's looking for a way to differentiate themselves, and this remains the most untapped way. And so I think today that's critical. I also think that we need more than ever for our employees to be bought into what we're doing in order to build those relationships with customers. And customers have more choices than ever as well. And so this is a time of ubiquitous information and a time of easy change and not the loyalty that used to exist. And so if we're going to build that loyalty, we have to do it through organizational health.
What are some examples of particularly healthy companies?
You know, lots of people ask this question about some examples of healthy companies. And there's plenty out there. I mean, it's still very much the minority. But when you look at big companies, and a lot of times people are looking for famous ones, and I've mentioned in my talk Southwest Airlines and Chick-fil-A being 2. But most of the great companies out there are not famous. And most of the great leaders out there are running medium-sized or small companies, and they're doing a fabulous job, but the purpose of their work is not to be famous. In the book, what I'm most proud of is in the first few pages, in the opening flap, there's about 20 different testimonials from companies that have run with this stuff and really made their organizations great. And one of the things they've said is that even during difficult economic times, they've been able to build new businesses, thrive, because they've made their organizations healthy. So there's a whole list of small to medium-sized companies, as well as a few big ones that have done this.
In your experience, what are the best practices you have seen to implement the organizational health model in our companies?
You know, here at the Table Group, we really do try to implement these principles. We eat our own dog food, as we say. And that means it's a lot of work, but it totally is worth it. But we are a big believer that we have to practice this stuff well if we're going to teach others to do it as well. And I think the thing we do best here is we are constantly refining ourselves as a team and pushing on one another to make sure that we are making each other better and that we're being true to making good decisions through good conflict and that we're being trustworthy and vulnerable with one another. And as a result of that, sometimes meetings can be hard, but they should be. And they can be not boring, which is great, but sometimes that's because we're really engaged with one another. And we are like a family now in that we argue passionately. Sometimes we get frustrated at one another. And after every one of those conversations, we realize that that's what's keeping us healthy. We're also very clear about why we exist It gets back to my dad and why, when he was working, and why we care about what we're doing, and that this is a mission-driven organization. We use our core values, our reasons for being, and our reasons for behaving in the hiring we do and the way we evaluate one another. And I think that we've always got that rallying cry, that thematic goal on the board. And every week we exercise the discipline of going through what's most important and how are we doing in the key areas to make that happen. So I think generally we've done a good job of sticking to this and not being the cobbler's children without shoes.
What are the common roadblocks you have experienced implementing an organizational health model? And how do you recommend we overcome them?
I think the biggest roadblock that we experience is when the CEO or the leader of the team feels like they want to abdicate responsibility or delegate responsibility for this. When the leader is not fully engaged, things break down. Building a healthy organization is absolutely job number one of a leader. And the CEO of an organization, more than anything else, has to lead the initiative to create that environment. So the biggest obstacle we find is when the leader says, yeah, this sounds great, but can't I get somebody else to do that? I really enjoy finance more or marketing more. The truth is, being a leader means this is job number one, and they have to be completely engaged.
Regarding the checklist for organizational health you share in your book on page 195, how do you recommend we use it? Is there a grading system we can follow to measure our progress implementing the model?
The checklists in the book, I think, are great tools because they really net it out and let a team evaluate themselves versus these 4 disciplines. There's no grading system. We do have kind of a survey online that companies can fill out, an online organizational health assessment. But what we definitely recommend is that people do the checklist and then have a qualitative talk about where they've done well, where they haven't. So it's really a tool not so much for grading themselves, but for identifying areas that they can improve on so they can dive in and get things done.
Having worked with companies for so many years, is there anything that still surprises you?
You know, I think what surprises me more than anything is how well this stuff works and what the ahas that go on. I think why I love my job is because I love to see the light bulb go on. Now, the funny thing is, though, it also surprises me that as many differences there are in business, how universal the problems that face organizations are. Like when I work with a church or a professional football team or a corporation or a small company, I'm shocked that most of what they're wrestling with is the same. Now, there are different flavors and different nuances, but organizations struggle for some very human reasons. And it still surprises me that it is as universal as it is.
Why are so few companies skilled at overcoming dysfunction?
I think most companies are not good at overcoming dysfunction because they don't realize that it is really a process and it's a rigorous one. They think that it's kind of as I like to say, they think it's like a flavor enhancer to business when it's actually the very plate upon which the meat and potatoes of business sits. We have to recognize that this is a rigorous discipline. And while it might not be as quantitative and as analytically precise as others, it is just as rigorous and just as real. And if we don't recognize that up front, we're not going to put in the time and the effort to make it happen.
In what ways is overcoming dysfunction in our company similar to overcoming dysfunction in our family?
You know, comparing the family to the company is a very interesting thing. Years ago, I went home to my wife. We have 4 boys in a fairly chaotic household. And I remember saying to her, you know, if my clients ran their companies the way we ran this family, they'd go out of business. And she was like, what do you mean by that? And so what I found is that a lot of the things we do in work, with some definite adjustments, because a family is not a company, but a lot of the principles apply at home. And if the husband and wife in a family build a healthy relationship, that allows them to build a healthy family. And if you get clear on why your family exists and what your unique strategy for being a family is and what your values are, it makes it so much easier to make decisions when somebody calls up and asks if your children want to be on the underwater travel lacrosse team or join some new club, and you're sitting there thinking, how do I make this decision? Should we do it or should we not? When you can reflect on what you've outlined in the key questions you need to answer, it makes life easier. And so I think many of the things that we talk about here apply in our families, but we shouldn't go about doing it the same way. It needs to be simpler, it needs to be shorter, and it needs to be something we can do a little bit more on the fly. I do have a book called The 3 Big Questions for a Frantic Family, which is essentially taking a lot of this information and applying it at home.
Gazelle's companies are fans of daily huddles. What do you recommend we do to implement an effective daily meeting?
Well, the daily huddle is a fabulous tool. I think it's a little different than my daily meeting, and I'm not prescriptive about this. I think a company needs to look at this stuff and use what works. And I know Vern is that way too. The point of this is to make your organization better, not just to stick to a prescription. So my daily check-in meeting is about just getting together to kind of flush the cache, technology people would say, to talk socially and to talk about what you're doing that day. Vern's daily huddle is a little bit more operational. It probably takes some of the tactical staff meeting that I do. It's a little bit better for companies that on a daily basis have to go through the key rocks, as they talk about, the key things they need to be working on. Mine is a little bit more informal, and I think that a company can look at those and borrow and use the things that work best. I think the huddle is a fabulous idea. I love the idea that it's about using the rhythm of daily coming together to get things done, even if there are nuances to how you do that.
Being a fan of your books, I've noticed that all your past books have been fables, but The Advantage isn't. Why?
You know, I chose not to make a fable out of this book because I think it's just too holistic. And I really wanted to present a comprehensive, integrated approach that people could read and then go out and apply. In my other books, you know, I was taking on more specific topics, so I could flesh those out differently. But when we put them all together, I considered a fable, but I realized it would probably have to be War and Peace. It was going to have to be, 500 pages, and it would be too difficult to tie in characters to paint this picture, because in different kinds of organizations, in different situations, it would require too much plot and probably be difficult to follow. So I thought this was the right time to write our first comprehensive, straightforward business book. But I have tried to use as many case studies as possible and even some humor to try to keep the reader engaged.
Pat, thank you. We really appreciate your time and are anxious to implement your guidance and improve the organizational health of our fast-growing companies. Thank you.
I'd like to finish by thanking everybody at Gazelles, Vern, a friend of mine, Daniel, a new friend of mine, and everybody else at Gazelles for having me. Your audiences are so hungry and so passionate about building great organizations. It's a pleasure for me to be on here, and thank you very much. God bless.